welcome to Hudson Institute. My name is Riley Walters. I'm Deputy Director here in our Japan chair. And thank you for joining us for our event, What to Expect from the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. China and the Indo-Pacific have been a point of focus in Washington these past few years, and rightly so. The U.S. is working with its allies and partners to modernize our defense capabilities in the Indo-Pacific, and the Biden administration has been all in on restoring America's diplomatic relationships. But one element that's really been missing from our strategy is an economic element. For years, our closest allies have been asking for the U.S. to be more economically engaged in the region. An annual survey from those in Southeast Asia regularly express not just the worry about China's economic influence in the region, but the desire for more U.S. economic engagement as well. And so this is sort of where this framework comes in, at least in part. But the framework is still very much in the editing stages of its coming together. And so we're expecting it to actually come out any week now, hopefully. The Quad Leaders Summit in Tokyo is scheduled at the end of next month, and so maybe that'll be a strong target for this new framework to be rolled out. But really, we don't know everything that's included in this framework just yet, but we do know quite a bit. And so what we do know of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is that it is co-led by the Commerce Department and the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. It includes 4 pillars. One, supply chain resilience. A second one is infrastructure, clean energy, and decarbonization. A third is tax and anti-corruption. And the 4th pillar is a fair and resilient trade. So Commerce Department is in charge of the supply chain, infrastructure, and clean energy, and tax and anti-corruption, while USTR is in charge of the trade pillar. These are broken down into smaller elements within each pillar. There's questions about digital and emerging technologies, labor, agriculture, transparency and good regulatory practices, competition-related matters, customs and trade facilitation issues, any other practices or measures that undermine market opportunities. And generally, the Commerce Department and USTR, as they think about this, have been generally interested in some of the general negotiating objectives. That's what we know so far about the framework itself. To become an actual member, though, of this framework, as far as we know, a country only really needs to commit to at least one of these 4 pillars. But I also suspect there might be some wiggle room there. There are probably about a dozen or so countries in Asia that have already expressed an interest in joining. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and more are generally good candidates for this framework. And so what we also know, and to kind of get around some of the misinformation out there about what we know, the framework is not a trade agreement, despite what you might hear at some congressional hearings. It is exclusively negotiated through the executive, which means Congress really doesn't have a role to play in these efforts. And there won't be any tariff negotiations, which limits the market access that the White House can give to potential members. Any market access that would be included will most likely be limited to the regulatory stage, any regulatory changes. Personally, I'm a bit skeptical about how far this new framework will go. Given the lack of ambition so far, I suspect that the framework won't gain much traction and could potentially be forgotten by the end of the year as other initiatives that the White House is doing takes precedent. But I do want to be optimistic because an American presence in Asia is important. So let's hear from some actual experts besides myself on this. First, let me introduce, we have to my left, Lotte Danielson. She is the Vice President of the U.S.-Taiwan Business Council. And to her left, we have Dr. John Lee, who is a Senior Fellow here at Hudson Institute. He is also a Senior Fellow at the U.S. Studies Center and an Adjunct Professor at the University of Sydney. I'd love to hear from you both for just maybe 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll go into some questions and answers. So up first, Dr. Lee, if you'd like to start us
Sure.
off.
Thanks, Riley, and thanks for having me on this panel. Look, I come from this question as obviously not an American, as you can tell by my accent. I'm based in Sydney, but as an Australian, as someone in that Indo-Pacific region or the Asia part of Indo-Pacific region. And you're absolutely right to say that the region has been calling out for the United States to demonstrate not strategic leadership but economic leadership, which many people believe have been lacking, frankly, since the Trump administration and entering into the Biden administration. Look, the simple answer to the question of what many of us would like to see is we would love to see a pathway for the US to get back in the TPP, but we know that's not going to happen. So let's accept that and use that as the beginning point in terms of looking at this framework. I think I'll begin with some more negative or pessimistic sentiments, and then, as I would like to do, end on a much more optimistic or potentially positive note. So from an Australian and regional perspective, a problem we see is that there has been more divergence now between the American perception of its domestic economic interests and the American perception of its international economic interests or roles and responsibilities. This began in the Trump era, as we know, and it's continued into the Biden era, and it seems to be a mainstay of American domestic politics. Now, to put in overly simplistic terms, there is a perception that, or perception in the US, that America is losing out from the global economic system, and it needs more to correct this balance. Right? This is very clear to us when we come here. And look, I have some sympathy for this view. It's not based on nothing. As the country is doing more to protect and advance the global international system, in some ways it has lost out, and often unfairly, in my view. So I have some sympathy with the American domestic perception. However, I would say that the main driver of America losing out, if you like, in my view, is mainly China gaming the system. It is not necessarily international economic system per se, it is China gaming the international economic system at America's expense and at the expense of other countries. And I know lots of countries do game the system, but it's the nature and size and extent, basically a scale of China gaming the system, which has made the global international economic system less tenable and less fair for Americans and other countries, in my view. So from this perspective, America, yes, has legitimate complaints, and this is precisely why, in our view, it's so important for the United States to enter TPP, but let's not go there. I mean, the TPP would have been not the fix-all, but it would have been like a major part of the solution to offering both carrots and sticks for countries to behave economically in certain ways. Instead, I think the US is looking more to shield itself in some respects from the international system, international economic system, which obviously makes it more difficult for any administration to exercise global economic leadership when a world's calling out for it. And so this brings me to the topic of this discussion, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Now, it won't be as comprehensive or as visionary as many of us would like. I mean, I think that's clear. It will probably read more like a laundry list of aspirations, objectives, and regulations. Part of that is due to the fact that, well, what you mentioned, that there are different agencies and entities overseeing it. They have different interests, as these things are the output of any sort of agency process is never particularly clean or necessarily coherent. So I think there will clearly be elements to it which will be more about protecting narrow American interests rather than providing common goods, if you like, to the Indo-Pacific. And this is probably going to be the case for a lot of aspects of manufacturing. I also have the sense that the framework may be of less interest to developing economies in the Indo-Pacific than it should be. I hope I'm wrong about this, because most economies in the Indo-Pacific are developing economies, and as it is, this is where China is actually making the most advances in these developing economies. Just to draw that out a little bit, Beijing has a very simple but attractive proposition for these developing countries. The proposition is, if you support our Chinese centric order and rules, yes, it will be hierarchical. Yes, Chinese firms will get the lion's share of opportunity and the rewards. But if you support it, we will give you immediate and guaranteed gains. Like, that is a very attractive proposition for a developing country. And as this Chinese sales pitch continues, contrast what we, the Chinese, offer you to what the Americans and the other liberal democracies offer you. They offer you a rules-based order that's based on merit, but you're probably not going to do that well in this merit-based order. So you're better off, participating in ours rather than committing yourself to the other one. So if you're a developing country or firm struggling to compete, the Chinese sales pitch is a very attractive one, and this is why it does worry me somewhat that, I hope I'm wrong, but it does worry me somewhat that the framework will probably not speak to developing economies as powerfully as it might. Now, let me offer some reasons for some optimism as to what this framework may deliver. It's pretty obvious that we now live in an age of geopolitical competition and conflict, even. The separation of geostrategy and economics is just no longer tenable. And this has forced America to think about economic concepts such as resilience, safe and secure supply chains, and economic partnerships, not for the sake of economics, but economic partnerships for strategic reasons. Now, in some circumstances, the notion of American resilience will be conflated with self-sufficiency. And in some areas, such as energy and agriculture, that's actually possible for the US. So, that's not necessarily going to involve or help a lot of other countries in the region. But I think in other areas, the framework will advance cooperation with allied and partner countries, particularly in critical and strategic sectors and products and technologies. And a list of what is critical and strategic is obviously context dependent, but we do know that that list will grow wider and wider and wider. So from that point of view, there'll be a lot more cooperation between selective but advanced economies than might otherwise be the case if there were no geostrategic competition. In terms of what that list might look like, I have a feeling, and it may not all be brought out in the framework, but over time I think it will reflect many of the sectors basically identified in the Made in China 2025 blueprint, which, by the way, is a very helpful list for all of us to sort of guide ourselves as to which sectors are actually important, or at least some of the sectors that are important to cooperate in. So I would expect some progress, and not necessarily with the framework itself, but I would expect the framework to provide the foundations for some progress on minilateral agreements with particularly advanced economies. The obvious low-hanging fruit ones are things like digital agreements. But my broader point is this will largely be driven by geopolitics and competition with China in particular. So just my opening remarks is, there are reasons to be negative, but there are reasons to be optimistic. And the reality of geopolitics means the United States actually can't withdraw into itself as much as some people in government, Congress, or the administration would like. So that's my note of optimism to end my opening remarks.
Yeah, I mean, as much as I'm pessimistic about this agreement, I definitely, it's hard to give it a policy in DC. It's never really just pass-fail. It's degrees of passing, degrees of failing, and there's a fair amount of both, I think, in this one.
Yeah.
So I think you definitely laid out a really good sort of broad-based analysis on sort of the geostrategic. Let me turn to Lada now and I think one of the interesting things about this is in DC we often talk about the government perspective, but we don't really hear so much about like the business industry, the ones who are actually making a lot of these investments and engaged more in these regions. And so, Lana, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, thanks so much, Riley and John. It's great to be here. I'm not an economist, but I do think a lot about trade and development, economic development in Asia. So it's always a pleasure to be here and talk about it. So as we said, the framework seems to be kind of a replacement for this rejoining the CPTPP. And so you've already laid out some of the issues, so trade and supply chains, infrastructure, climate, energy, all those things, tax and anti-corruption issues as well to be covered under this agreement. I share your slight skepticism about where this agreement will take the U.S. and where we're going with it. Yes, absolutely, there is appetite in the Indo-Pacific for U.S. economic engagement. There's no question about that. But I do think the timeline in particular it's such an ambitious kind of framework, and we're looking at a very comprehensive agreement with potentially many partners. And the timeline that they've identified, which I think is 18 months, seems quite ambitious. I do think also there's quite a lot of lack of clarity on what it is that we've seen some discussion on what they're trying to accomplish, but there's a lot of unanswered questions. So what form will this take exactly? Which function will it serve exactly as well? USTR had a public comment period that ended earlier this week. And I think that gave us a little bit of an understanding of what USTR is looking at. But in general, I think clarity on that is not that great. In particular, what are the partners that we're looking for? Which partners are we going to do? How many are we going to do? That's a lot of that. And what will it mean for the partners beyond the political dimension? As you mentioned, market access is not particularly, it's not part and parcel of this. And so what does it actually mean for the partners that we're looking at? The rhetoric that we've seen so far seems really focused on what the US benefits are and not what the benefits are for our potential partners. I also have a question about how it will fit with other bilateral and multilateral initiatives that we're already doing or that we're considering doing. So for example, there have been talks about an agreement between Taiwan, the US, and South Korea on semiconductor, and that would cover some of the same issues that we're seeing for this. And so how will that fit together is I think, a question. As you mentioned, the interagency structure is sort of up in the air. We got USTR, we got commerce, but some of the issues are really the purview of other departments. So the State Department does some parts, the agriculture does some parts, and how does that all fit together? I think it's going to be very interesting to see. Another thing that I personally have a concern about is bandwidth, right? Is there bandwidth within the US bureaucracy on this particular agreement? USTR has said that they will not do a bilateral trade agreement with Taiwan because there's no bandwidth for that. Well, they have bandwidth for this. So, how does that work? And is there appetite in the United States government for this kind of really broad-based, sustained effort in Asia? I think that's an outstanding question as well. And like you mentioned, how do you keep it going? Is this going to be a Biden administration thing that gets pushed away later in the U.S., or is it something that we can sustain and keep going and have a resilience for? I think that's a question too. Now, obviously, there are two pieces to this discussion that I think really jumps out to me as potentially achievable, and that's, as you mentioned, the digital economy agreement. Most of the countries around the world have a digital economy issues that they're trying to solve. Everybody has data privacy and cybersecurity and those types of issues. Of course, there are some that are more vulnerable than others and some that have more money to spend on these kinds of things than others. But it is definitely something that everybody around the world is looking into. And the second thing would be supply chains, right? We have seen during the pandemic so much talk about supply chains: food, pharmacy, cars, and of course, semiconductors. And so I think that that is something that is also a general thing that the countries around the world would be very interested in solving. Now, I think it's going to be very interesting to see where we end up with this once we get a little bit more clarity. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about Taiwan as well. We believe that Taiwan should be a first-round negotiation partner for this framework. It could really help United States achieve their goals in the region. Now, others do not agree with that, obviously, but USTR has been quite coy about what it might mean, or if they would even consider Taiwan to be part of this. But I do think there's so many reasons for having Taiwan as being part of it. One of them, the main one, being that Taiwan is a huge trading partner for the U.S. It's our 8th largest trading partner. If you look at other Indo-Pacific countries, who are likely to be in the conversation, as you mentioned, some of the usual suspects. If you look at Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and so on, Japan and South Korea are the top, but Taiwan ranks right up there, right after them and before Vietnam. So it's really important, I think, to include Taiwan. Secondly, Taiwan is a huge part of the global technology supply chain. And this is something that this framework is trying to address. And so I think it's important to have Taiwan be part of the conversation. Taiwan is an important, a critical partner for US technology companies like Apple, like Qualcomm, and a slew of other countries around the world as well. Taiwan companies like Foxconn and Pegatron and some of the ones that you never heard of, but they're playing an important part of the technology that enables us to do our product, increase our productivity in the US. And so I think that's a really important point. And of course, then you add in that, the semiconductor industry, where companies like TSMC are global behemoths when it comes to cutting edge semiconductors. And so to have Taiwan as being part of this part and parcel, this framework, I think is really important. They bring a lot to the table. Finally, I do think that Taiwan is a reliable and important partner already. We are, they're part of the WTO, they're part of APEC, so they're, a long-term partner with the United States on a variety of different things. And so it really makes sense to have them be part and parcel of the framework in Asia. They've been really supportive of Russian sanctions. They've been working on digital economy already with the US. They're standing up a digital economy ministry later this year, and that is, I think, is really important. They've been working on things like transparency, trade secrets protection, IPR protection, and where there are lingering issues, such as there was a recent report on migrant workers in Taiwan and some of their labor issues. And this might be something that this framework could help address, as opposed to not addressing it at all. So, and also think there is a national security implication, a global strategy implication for the United States, where a strong Taiwan is in the United States' best interests. So, including Taiwan makes sense. It's a representation of the U.S. commitment to Taiwan, as well as the commitment to existing partners in the region. Excluding Taiwan, I think there's no doubt that it's a consideration, what will China do? How will China react? Not maybe just for the US, but for other partners in the region, what will that mean for those partners? And I do think that, I'm working on Taiwan, I'm quite tired of sort of Chinese tantrums over Taiwan. And I think that the United States should look at our national interests, as opposed to what the sovereignty sort of reasons are for China to oppose it. And we really think that this is an important part. Taiwan should play an important role in this agreement. So.
Wonderful. You made a lot of good points. I'm just going to piggyback off of real quick before I go into questions and answers. I think you make a really good case for Taiwan being a member of this. Honestly, if we look at the framework as it is now and the rhetoric that's sort of been said about it, it's talking about higher standards. And really, it's the advanced economies that it's not really a big problem for them to address these issues, and therefore shouldn't be really that much of a barrier for them to be a part of this. And so Taiwan, I think, makes an excellent...
Riley, can I quickly jump in and just second the Taiwan issue in case it goes away?
Yeah.
I completely agree, because there are a host of countries in a region, Japan, Australia, just to name two, who want and need to make economic agreements with Taiwan, and Taiwan wants to make them with them. But they won't or can't do it until the United States does it.
Yes.
So if the United States can get over the line, I completely agree with you. It's in the interest for the US and the Taiwanese to do that. But if the US and Taiwan can do that, I can almost guarantee there'll be a host of other countries that will do similar, and that will lead to a far better situation than we're in now. I just thought that should be emphasized.
No, I appreciate that, and it really, I would encourage that as much as possible. But I would also say, at least for the U.S. case, I hope that this framework does not become a substitute to a bilateral trade agreement with the United States and Taiwan. Yes. I think that is 40 years overdue, and it's time to happen. But of course, USTR I think tends to put these things around, while the national security side of it, I think they make a better argument for why this should happen.
Couldn't agree with you more.
Okay, you mentioned another thing about sort of overlapping initiatives, and I want to list off a few of these that have just been announced either this year or past 2 years. We have a new strategic commercial dialogue with Australia. We have a U.S.-Japan Economic 2+2 Partnership on Trade, Competitiveness and Reliance Partnership. With Taiwan, we have the new Trade and Technology Council. There's a slew of new initiatives that you would think could feed into this, but you could also make the argument that they will compete with the bandwidth of the Commerce Department and other agencies to actually be able to provide to this. And so I think that's one of I share that skepticism as well about the bandwidth. Another thing that's worried me is we heard Catherine Tai testify not too long ago in front of Congress about the Biden administration's trade agenda. And of course, the framework was brought up, and Taiwan was brought up as well. And she made this note that the framework isn't going to substitute for TIFA, which means that the trade and investment framework negotiations with Taiwan that we've had for several decades now. This will not be a substitute for that, which it does again bring in this question of, will we be able to have the bandwidth to not just bring in the partners that we think should be a part of this, but also new partners? And so that's an awkward way to segue into my first question, partners in this agreement. And from my point of view, it seems like the Biden administration's goal, being so diplomatically minded as they are, is to get as many partners in this as possible. But I think there's a tug of war going on between the high standards that some want to see in this versus the lower standards which they need to get more partners. And so where is this balance, you think, going to fall out? John, maybe because you've kind of, what do you think about the scope of the number of partners we can maybe even get into this thing to begin with?
Well, rather than begin with, which country should we focus on? Because every country will say should focus on us first. It's probably more useful to begin with, why is the US doing this, right? I mean, I know there are a number of reasons, but there's basically two in my mind. One is the geostrategic reason, and two, the second reason is to try to get a better outcome for the US, right? And then when you have those two reasons in mind, I would sort of separate then potential partners into, it's crude separation, but it's useful, advanced economies with similar institutions and developing economies which don't have, similar institutions. Advanced economies are far better partners when it comes to doing the sort of high-end institutional standards type deals, right? I mean, to be blunt about it, Australia, Japan, or South Korea is going to have far more similar views on standards than, say, a developing country like Indonesia, right? So you need a advanced economy strategy, if you like, to target things that advanced economies would want and that America could get something out of. Mm-hmm. And then the developing economy aspect, which has a very strong strategic undercurrent to it. You basically don't want China to dominate these developing economies, and you want these developing economies to have an alternative to just Chinese finance and ultimately Chinese governance. So I think you can separate it that way. And when you do that, then you can focus on the high-end agreements and not waste your time with high-end agreements with countries that just aren't good fits. And then you can focus on the sort of developing economies aspect. So that's one way of at least trying to separate issues such that there is maximum achievement for minimum effort, if you like.
Where do you think, I know this is probably one of a few things that we've mentioned that could be something that comes out of this is the digital agreement, digital trade agreement. I know we had representatives from Singapore and Washington recently. Catherine Tai also went to Singapore. It's something that there is a lot of groundwork, a lot of legwork's already been, ground has been covered on this issue. Do you feel that it might fall in between between those two categories of the developing perspective versus the developed country perspective? And then I'm sure companies in Taiwan and US companies as well have an interest in this as our economy has advanced too, more into the digital side and services side. That's a weird question, but I mean, what do you think? Where do you think this digital agreement falls in the priorities of this deal? The framework, I mean.
I'll go quickly and
please.
And certainly hand it over. On digital, I called it low-hanging fruit because particularly with advanced economies, I mean, there's a clear need for it. They've sort of got the institutions and already the standards largely worked out. I mean, you could use as a model, for example, the Australia-Singapore digital agreements, just one example, but you could use that as a model. And it's also consistent with the geostrategic objectives that the United States has, which is to create a safe and secure ecosystem, if you like. Now, when it comes to developing countries, you can't have the same kind of digital agreement, not at this stage anyway. With developing countries, it's more about giving them options and preventing them from jumping irretrievably into the Chinese digital ecosystem. Basically, that's what you want to achieve. But with advanced economies, it's more than that. It's about building an actual safe, secure digital ecosystem.
Interesting.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I do think that there's a lot of difference between advanced economies and developing economies when it comes to the digital. But it's interesting to see that seems to be kind of the grouping that we're going to probably see in as they're trying to develop this. And I do think that the digital economy has a lot of things that they can do on both sides. Like you said, on high standards for more advanced economies and working with them to kind of build the ecosystem. You got a lot of digital economy infrastructure, those types of things that you have to consider. But again, they've been talking to countries like Taiwan and Australia and other places about the digital economy. This is not a new thing, and just start there, I think, is useful. One thing that I think maybe not people talking that much about is India. Like, what's going to happen with India? Because they have been a little bit more reluctant to talk about how they see this potential agreement, and there's a lot of things that go. And if you take India out, it's not Indo-Pacific anymore, right? So, that's going to be really interesting to see. I don't know enough about India to say whether the digital economy agreement might be something that they would be willing to sort of step into, but I do think that that's going to be a really important piece of both sides, both who's going to join in and the digital economy piece.
I think we see this similar concern when we talk about the Quad generally and expanding that out into more economic opportunities and things like that. I don't know if you looked like you might have.
I mean, just on India, I'm glad you raised India because it sort of doesn't really fall into either category because India is sort of like China, has elements of developing country and elements of advanced economy. For the sake of my crude classification, India doesn't fit, even though India doesn't fit sort of naturally or seamlessly into the advanced economy group, I would almost be tempted to treat them that way because they have certain capabilities and aspects to the economy that do fit. And from a geostrategic point of view, they're just far too important to effectively, exclude when you're talking about high-end agreements. So India is going to be harder work for many reasons, but I think there's sort of an exception that, you've got to try to bring them along when it comes to high-end agreements.
Let's talk about the elephant in the room. Again, I know we've talked about China a little bit already, but as far as I can tell, this agreement is not, again, the Biden administration doesn't have a China strategy. They were explicit in the Indo-Pacific strategy when they rolled that out that that was not their China strategy. And so we haven't seen it. We don't know where it is or when it's going to come out, and this is coming out first. But again, this, just like it's not a trade agreement, is not a China strategy. And I would not be surprised if the word China doesn't appear even once in this document. And there's an argument to be made of why that is. It's again to kind of get some of the developing countries who don't want to be caught up in the U.S.-China competition. And so it's maybe a strategy to include more countries in this as possible, but it really is, I think, the major concern for a lot of these countries. Again, like we were talking about at the beginning, China has basically taken share from the United States and other developing countries across Southeast Asia, and it's become a concern. So, what do we think about China not being in this? Do you think that's the right approach? Do you think China should be more explicitly in this at the risk of losing some potential members? Or should they continue as it is and, again, kind of shirk the China problem, kick the can down the road a little bit further and hope that this new economic framework will ultimately answer that question anyway? I don't know.
I mean, China is, like you said, the giant elephant in the room. I think reading the statements that have been made about this agreement and talking to people who are much more knowledgeable about it than I am, it really does seem that sort of China is put to the side, and we're just not going to even go there because it is such a power competition. They want to try to be inclusive. I think that's very clear, but that does not extend to China, I don't think. And it kind of makes sense. You don't want to include a big competitor in something like this.
Oh, I wasn't implying that the agreement would include China. I mean the sentiment around why this framework is important, which is competing with China and offering upmarket opportunities. That won't necessarily be highlighted as much in this. And so is that a?
I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah.
Look, I have no idea whether China will be mentioned in the document or not, but what I would say is that we wouldn't even be talking about the need for a new framework if it wasn't for China, right? So from a credibility point of view, the framework doesn't need to be about this is how we take on China. But if the framework doesn't take into account how the United States is going to cope in pushing back and offering a more credible alternative to what China is offering, then the framework itself won't have credibility. Right? If you look around a region, countries around a region, they're not naive. They realize China is the big issue. If the United States comes up with overarching frameworks without reference to China either implicitly or explicitly, that framework will therefore lack credibility, and there'll be less faith that the United States actually is able to provide a credible alternative. So it doesn't have to, the way it's presented, it doesn't have to be presented as a China strategy, but it's got to be at least linked implicitly to a broader China strategy.
Maybe this isn't the right, maybe we can have another panel on this other topic, but I want to talk maybe politics for a second. And the United States, Taiwan, Australia, all three countries have elections this year at different times. The US and Taiwan a little bit closer together, Australia very soon. Do you think that these play any influence in what either is going into the framework or what might come out of the framework?
Oh, look, I mean, from the Australian point of view, we have an election on the 21st of May. We're in a fortunate position as a country that there's broad agreement on the challenge China poses and the need for an economic strategy in addition to a security strategy to deal with this. and both parties have bought into that. So, you know, I'm not here as a spokesperson for my country, but if you spend any time in Australia, you'll realise that there is a genuine bipartisan consensus that a robust economic framework led by the United States is a necessity. So I don't see any sort of problems from this, you know, coming from the Australian side of things.
Sure.
I think from the Taiwan side, it's not. It's more of a general. You know, how do you tilt towards? Do you tilt towards the U.S., which is what the current Taiwan administration is doing? Do you tilt towards China, which is what some people would prefer to see? And so I don't think that the framework itself will be part of the discussion and it's not a presidential election. It's you know, local elections. I don't think that will be. It's much more. China will be a focus, obviously, but sort of this more sort of broad geostrategic kind of issue is probably not going to be as important as what's happening with COVID and you know, supply chains and things like that.
Of course. Well, this has been wonderful. I don't know if you want to offer up any closing remarks. If not, we can close it out.
You know, I'm not, as I guess a closing comment, I don't expect the world of this framework, but the framework has to give us an indication as to how the administration is going to marry economics and security, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is the world is watching to see whether, from an economic point of view, the Biden administration is economically isolationist or more isolationist, or actually the globalist elements of it will come out. So I think this framework, you know, hopefully it may not provide answers or solutions, but hopefully gives us indicators as to you know, those two questions.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I do think that when we actually have more information, I think it will give us. But I mean, just moving forward on like you said, and the economic framework in the Indo-Pacific, I think is an important step forward. Engaging with as many countries in Asia as possible, and continuing to have discussions on how can we improve things. You know, this is supposed to be a worker-centric and sort of economic development type of agreement, and I think everybody who watches it agrees that this is an important piece. But again, we just don't know enough quite yet. You know, maybe in a year we can have this conversation again.
Yeah, we can do a follow-up with the sort of takeaways from the actual document, and whether it will be successful in sort of changing the attitude in the region.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again to you both for joining us today, and thank you all for joining us online. See you all in the future. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.